Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists to report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, activists, government leaders. We speak with each one to one. I'm happy to welcome New York Times op-ed columnist Gail to the program today. She's been busy poking holes in the armor of the political figures who've been in the news lately. But she also took a detour to the past to focus on William Henry Harrison, the 9th President of the United States. The reign of this complex and little-known subject lasted only 1 month, but his campaign inaugurated the modern style of meet and greet politics that we see today. William Henry Harrison, part of the American President series, has just been published by Times Books. Welcome.
Thank you.
You write that you chose to write about Harrison partly as an act of familial penance.
This is true. He's spent most of his life in Cincinnati, which is where I came from. And the famous thing about him was that he was the son of the signer of the Declaration of Independence, but he was marketed as this humble soldier living in a log cabin. And when I was in Cincinnati with another book some years ago, I'm telling my parents this story, and they said he lived in a log cabin, but he really had a very nice house. And my father's sitting there, and he said, "It was a very big house." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "I tore it down." It turned out it was on the property of the Cincinnati Gas and Electric Company, and they were afraid it was going to be landmarked. So they sent out a team of guys one night to tear it down, led by my father. So I owed him a book, yeah.
Is to resurrect.
Give him some time.
Give him some time. How would you describe Harrison? Was he a guy who just wanted to get along, make a living that would allow him to support his large family, and who sort of stumbled into the pages of history?
Yeah, I mean, he was always a prominent guy. He was a youngest son, so he didn't really, the older sons in his family had been prepared for politics, for business, and they were kind of running out of professions by the time they got to him. So they were preparing him for a career in medicine. And then his father died, and I gather that William Henry never really wanted a career in medicine because he then very quickly got a commission, signed up for the Army, which was not an in thing to do back then because the British were gone and it was fighting with the Indians, which nobody thought was all
living out on the
frontier. It was both not prestigious and also really uncomfortable. Plus, they tended to lose a lot. The Indians were doing very well, so there was no good reason you'd want to do that unless you were trying to make a name for yourself. So he was successful in the Army. I don't think he was the greatest general in the history of the universe, but his men loved him, and he seemed to be brave, and he worked hard.
So he was a good soldier,
yeah,
but not quite the hero that he was made out to be.
No. I mean, all of his two big victories in his life were both involved a ton more people on his side than the other side. He was very good at outnumbering the opposition when he had a big fight. So he wasn't a great general, but he wasn't a bad general. And basically, he had 10 kids. He had 10 kids, and they all but one, I think, lived to adulthood, which was very unusual back then. And they all had kids, and then they started dying off. So he had all these widowed daughter-in-laws and all these orphaned grandchildren, and he had all these old soldiers coming by, who had to be entertained, and he just wanted a job. And he spent most of his time nagging people, he got very briefly an ambassadorship. He finally, when he was nominated for president the first time, he was the clerk of court in Cincinnati, which made him he was very happy. And, he ran for various things, but it was mainly really about the supporting all these people.
Trying to make a living, right. He spent a good number of years as a territorial governor, first in the Northwest Territory, then in the Indiana Territory. And I didn't realize that the job of the territorial governors was basically to buy land from the Indians dirt cheap so that you could build up these territories which would later become states.
Right. I mean, their vision back then, and you're talking then in the early 1800s, was that the United States would be a country that ran to the Mississippi River, and that they would buy up all the land, and then the Indians would hopefully move across the Mississippi River and go continue their normal way of life elsewhere. It wasn't an aggressive in the sense that we want to kill all these people. It wasn't a genocidal kind of plan. It was just sort of a business deal. And the way you would do it was you would make a deal with often the weakest tribe in a neighborhood, who would then sell the land, which was used by a number of other tribes because they weren't very, there weren't any boundaries in Indian land. And then the United States would simply announce that this was now their land, and everybody had to.
And all the other tribes who felt it was their land would realize that they'd been sold down the river.
Yeah, totally sold down the river. And William Henry's first big, military victory involved a coalition of different Indian tribes in Ohio, who were just outraged that their land had been sold out from under them to some other little tribe that they had nothing to do with, and that was finally a victory there. I mean, for a long time the Indians were winning, and then Mad Anthony Wayne from the Revolutionary days came marching in, and he got everybody organized, and he was sort of the one that won the day.
Mm-hmm.
But this business of buying off, and William Henry millions of acres. He
claimed 50 million.
Yeah,
right?
he bought really a really huge hunk of the east of the Mississippi, Middle West, and that was his big job.
Now the log cabin that he became associated with was this. I mean, it actually was made of logs.
There was a log cabin
right outside of Cincinnati, but it was a big log cabin, right?
Well, when he first got out of the Army, in fact, when he was still in the Army, but kind of making his transition, he got married, and for a while he and his wife lived in a nice log cabin, but a log cabin. And then as time went on, they built a big house, and they kept the log cabin there, so that if you went up apparently into one of the bedrooms and opened one of the closets, there was a little chink, and you could peek in.
See a log.
Really see a log. So there was a log there somewhere.
After he left the Army for good, he tried a number of businesses, none of which were successful. And he was a relentless pursuer of public jobs and appointments. You mentioned some of the elected to Congress from Ohio and then also from Indiana, elected to the state Senate, chosen as a U.S. Senator by the Ohio legislature, appointed minister to Columbia, became clerk of the county courts in Ohio. Tended to be short tenure.
For the most part. I think he probably would have stayed with the county clerk job forever if it hadn't been for the presidency. But he was also farming. He had this very big swath of territory along the Ohio River, and he built homes for himself and for his children there, and several of his children lived along. It was like Hyannisport, except, slightly less Kennedy-esque, I guess.
Now, in the 1836 presidential election, he became the Whig Party's candidate for presidency against Martin Van Buren. It seemed like a sort of fallback candidate, right?
He was totally a fallback candidate. He was. This had happened a number of times around then. There really had been only one party for a while, the Democrats. They were an organized political party, and then everybody else was kind of flopping around. But the Whigs, which was the Whig Party, which became Harrison's party eventually, organized themselves totally around their hatred of Andrew Jackson. That's all they had going. Otherwise, they didn't agree about anything.
Mm-hmm.
So it was sort of very hard to come up with a candidate who matched your mushmash of different theories. So at that point, in '36, they decided they'd nominate a bunch of different regional candidates. And then they would all run, and then maybe they would get enough electoral votes that you'd throw the whole thing into the House of Representatives. This is a theory that comes up all the time. It's like a bartered convention. It never really happens, but that was their hope. So he ran as the sort of the Western guy that time around, and he actually did best and came in second and showed some real strength. It was because of him that poor Martin Van Buren, when he organized his ticket, picked a guy named Richard Johnson from Kentucky, a senator, as his vice president, because Richard Johnson had been an Indian fighter. In fact, had been with Harrison in the same battle in which the great chief Tecumseh, who was the scourge of all, had been killed. And everybody knew Harrison didn't kill Tecumseh. Some people thought maybe Richard Johnson did. Nobody knew for sure.
Right.
It wasn't clear. So if you were running around and somebody said Tippecanoe and Tyler too, you were supposed to say, Rumpty, Umpty Dumpty, Colonel Johnson shot Tecumseh. So that would people would be overwhelmed.
That was the Democratic retort.
That was the Democratic retort. They were, I'm sure overwhelmed by this, but that's how they got Richard Johnson.
Okay, so he lost that first election.
He lost the first election, but did better than people thought he would.
Okay, and then he became the candidate again in 1840. He was chosen over Senator Henry Clay, who was a real statesman, very successful senator, but who was also a Mason, and some of the Whigs didn't like that.
It was a weird time. We'll never live through the point at which we understand about the anti-Masonic movement, but there was an entire political party devoted to being against the Masons at this point in time. I think it had to do with insiders versus outsiders, but and he was a slave owner. Henry Clay should have been the candidate. Henry Clay founded the Whig Party. He was sort of the guy who represented what vision they had, which was about a more aggressive government that did internal improvements, built roads, improved the economy, kind of ran the economy. But he was a slave owner. And half of the Whig Party was abolitionist. The great thing about William Henry Harrison, he was born on a plantation. His father had owned slaves. He had sort of, kind of, for a while, owned maybe a few slaves, but then he turned them into servants, and then they were finally gone, and it was all kind of confusing. So once again, he was the logical choice, because you couldn't really figure out what he thought.
Right.
And he could campaign, because back then, you had no national media. You could go down south and say one thing, come back north and say something else, and nobody would stop you. Mm-hmm. So he was the most muddled candidate, and because of that, he was the most popular. And
also, the other possibility was Daniel Webster. I tend to think about the devil and Daniel Webster, but he was also a very prominent senator.
And he was an abolitionist.
Right.
He was the other side. Yeah.
And you had these two really good candidates, but the fallback was to Harrison.
And ironically, the guy, one of the people who put the whole thing together, went to see Webster and said, would you please serve as vice president? I think he's going to be a very weak president. He can do all the stuff. And Webster said, no, 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 and just poo-pooed it. If he had taken it, of course, he would have been president after a month.
Right.
But irony of ironies.
We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with more with New York Times op-ed columnist Gail Collins, her latest book, William Henry Harrison.
Well, I first started skating with my friend. He had an extra board, and then he just gave it to me, and I've been skating ever since. Well, when I don't land a trick and I have my mind set on something, and I'm not getting what I want, I just keep going for it until I get it right.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with the journalist Gail Collins. Her latest book, William Henry Harrison, one of the American President series published by the Times book imprint of Henry Holt and Company. Do you see any similarities between the 1840 presidential campaign and what's happening now?
Well, both do have this sort of little side hysteria about rich guys running. And, William Henry dealt with that very easily. He just pretended not to be rich. Much harder for Mitt Romney.
But they made out that his opponent
Yes, that was so ironic.
But he wasn't.
Poor Martin Van Buren was the son of from Kinderhook, New York, a son of a tavern owner, a very humble birth, who had self-taught, made his own way in the world completely. And he is being denounced in this campaign in 1840 as the rich guy who dines off gold plates and who, does all these strange things and who just wants to wear the best clothes and then suddenly he morphs into this person who was so rich, had this great posh upbringing, while his poor William Henry Harrison was this humble soldier. William Henry Harrison was born on a plantation on the river,
Right.
in Virginia. And poor Martin Van Buren was born in a tavern, but somehow they managed to morph identities somewhere along the line.
You describe the campaign of 1840 as the first, well, I think you also describe it as ridiculous, but you also describe it as the
Not the first ridiculous.
but you also describe it as the first modern presidential campaign. How so was it ridiculous, and how so was it the
Well,
first
it was
modern
both in the
campaign?
same way. You were marketing a candidate as a commodity. It was very important to the handlers that there be a story arc, that people could identify with this story. And the story accidentally kind of morphed into this thing about how he's a humble soldier sitting in his log cabin. And people ran with that. And you'd have parades with one log cabin float after another, and people were dancing the log cabin two-step. And you had ties with log cabins on them. There was a guy named Booze, who was a distiller, who put together one of those sort of pottery-like, whiskey bottles and made it in the shape of a log cabin. It was very popular, and that's how the word booze became part of our, lexicon. It was and you were rolling balls, big, huge. People would have big, huge 5-foot wide balls with the name of the candidate on it, and the trick was to roll it through as many towns as possible. And then one side would try to steal the other side's ball, and there would be big fights. People were killed doing this kind of stuff. It was so off the charts, but people back then lived, very quiet and simple
bored.
lives.
They
They were
needed something to
bored
do.
out of their minds, and suddenly there's this ball rolling and dancing and flagpole raising and lots of parades, lots of roasting oxen all over the place, and of course there was attached to the log cabin was hard cider. He was drinking hard cider in his log cabin. That was the image. So there were much hard cider was going around. People loved this stuff. This was the most ridiculous campaign as far as any connection to real issues. But 80-something% of the voters who were eligible turned out to vote. It was the highest participation in the history of American democracy.
It's amazing. What was the Whigs' political platform?
Duh. It was both things. If it was anything, I think it was sort of that you would like the government to be more active in building roads, fixing the economy and improving it, creating more schools, stuff like that. But even that, half of them didn't agree on. And on the slave thing, they were totally divided. On the bank issue, which was very complicated back then, they were totally divided. It was
Whether you would have a national bank or
yeah, it was just
right.
everybody hated Andrew Jackson for one reason or another, and they were all aligned. It happens a lot today, obviously.
Yeah.
People are much better at getting together about the person they hate than what they actually want to do.
But we do know that Harrison did believe that the federal government should have a big hand in economic development. He believed that it should build roads and canals and public schools. And we do know that on slavery, well, he was sort of like, he didn't like it personally, but he wasn't going to stand in the way of slave owners.
He was sort of one of those typical well-meaning, good-hearted, totally lacking in any kind of moral courage kind of guys. And, his vision was that you shouldn't be having slaves, people bought and sold, but that if you happen to be a rich person whose assets were all tied up in human beings, you could not certainly expect this person to lose his assets. That would be unthinkable. So he kind of tried to jump back and forth.
Right. So he won.
He won, yay! And he was so happy. This is a guy who wanted to campaign. He was the first president to actually campaign for office. He went out and made speeches and shook hands and all that. He was so happy about this whole thing. He had this job. He never expected this. He was the clerk of courts a few years before. And so he got to Washington, and he's shaking hands all the way up the river, and the Whigs are crazy with delight. This is the first time anti-Jackson people have had a candidate ever. And they won. They can't believe it. Everybody's thrilled. He's walking around Washington shaking hands with everybody and giving out the first bunch of jobs. And
was this the first time? Okay, you'd had the Democrats, which was what Andrew Jackson was. Was this the first time you had two parties, or had there been?
Well, you had the Federalists, sort of. You had the Federalists by themselves for a while, and then with Jefferson.
And that was Jefferson.
Yeah, but it wasn't until Andrew Jackson that you actually, because this was all just a bunch of small number of white guys who owned property dealing around with it. It wasn't until Andrew Jackson where you had actual going out to regular people, voters, and trying to get them organized. So it was a very new thing.
So you said there was a record number of eligible voters who participated, And that's never again been replicated.
No.
Why? Why? Why?
They were,
Do we need to start rolling balls from town to town?
maybe, well, partly it was because you had this point at which you had a popular election, but not so popular that there weren't still a lot of people kept out of it, of course. You didn't have, women couldn't vote, and blacks couldn't vote.
And if you, in some places, if you weren't a landowner.
In some states, landowners couldn't vote. So it was
Right.
still fairly narrow. But I do think it was that being so bored and then being able to just be for your guy, whoever your guy was. And in this insane election in which there was no doubt in anybody's mind that their guy was their guy, whoever their guy happened to be.
So once elected, Harrison was pestered mercilessly by job seekers. I remember that. Well, was it worse in those days
Yeah.
than it is now?
In some ways it was, because there wasn't really, if you were a middle class sort of person, you didn't really have options. I mean, people weren't really normally sending their children off to school to learn a trade, like being an engineer or something like that. It was, you know, really, if you wanted a middle class job, look at William Henry Harrison himself. If you wanted a middle class job and you didn't have land of your own, you looked to the government. You wanted a government job. And there were all these people who'd been cut out throughout the Jackson administration, and they were going nuts. They were chasing him down the street. He couldn't get out of his room without being assaulted by all these people begging for jobs.
You have the 2-hour inaugural speech.
The dreaded 2-hour inaugural speech.
In cold, wet weather with no top coat. You felt he was trying to make a point.
Yeah, he had done that throughout the campaign. He tried to make very long, energetic speeches outdoors.
Because
to
he's
show,
67 years old.
Yeah,
and
he's
trying to,
old by their standards, and he wanted to show that he was hale and hearty, and he did, except for that last time. It didn't work out.
Was it at least a good speech?
It was a terrible speech. It was the worst speech ever. You read that speech, and you have no earthly idea what the heck this man was planning on doing about anything. It was just all very vague and blah, blah, blah. First sentence was 100 words long. I mean, it was unlistenable to.
So, probably as a result of that speech, he contracted pneumonia and died 3 weeks later.
Yep.
I guess, 1 month after he
was there.
came into
he was
office.
in office for exactly a month. He's the only president who never appointed a federal judge. Mrs. Harrison was the only first lady since the building of the White House who never set foot in the White House. She was still packing.
Right, right.
Back in Cincinnati.
Right.
And John Tyler, his vice president, had been picked totally accidentally at the convention. They were looking for somebody who would align the Clay people, who were very angry about Henry Clay not being the nominee. And none of the Clay people wanted the nomination because they were all sort of in a snit. And so there was a rumor that Tyler, who was a Virginian, who was very anti-Jackson, but that was the extent of his alignment with the Whigs, had been seen weeping after Henry Clay lost the nomination, which apparently wasn't true. He could have cared less about Henry Clay. They offered it to him. He took it. He's sitting at home. Vice presidents didn't even come to Washington back then. They were so completely beside the point. And then one day,
He's president.
he's president. And nobody even knew what to do. You'd never had that happen before. They didn't even know whether he got to be president or not at that point.
What kind of president do you think, had he lived?
William Henry Harrison?
What kind of president would he have been? I know it's hard to
His
say.
face would not be on Mount Rushmore. I think. I suspect he would have muddled on through. During that period between Jackson and the Civil War, there was just a lot of muddling on through. There was just no way you could get the country together and move forward. But he would have been very charming. He was a lovely guy.
So what would you say was his legacy? I mean, obviously not necessarily but as a man, as a politician, as a whatever.
A great reminder to wear warm clothes in bad weather.
And also, if you're going to go fight Indians, to have, at least outnumber them by
Right,
at least
try to outnumber them.
by at least 3 to 1. So how are you enjoying covering this current election?
Wow, it's been great so far. It's been almost as ridiculous as 1840, without the log cabins.
Okay. Well, it's really a very interesting book
Thank
about
you. A guy we don't often talk about.
A guy we don't often talk about.
Never
and with
comes
good
up.
reason. But I want to thank Gail Collins for joining me. You can read her column each Thursday and Saturday on the op-ed page of the New York Times. Her latest book, William Henry Harrison, has been published by Times Books imprint of Henry Holt and Company. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.